So we're going to be looking at the interplay between the different types of statutory advocacy. Gary, I know you've got a lot of experience across the board. Lisa, just remind me what type of advocacy you are involved in delivering. Are you a Care Act advocate or IMCA or both? Just pop that in Care Act. Lovely. Okay, so if I'll try and concentrate on Care Act a little bit, but we will be covering all different types today. So let's just go through the different type of advocacy. So how many different types of statutory advocacy roles do you think we have, in the UK? Just pop your answer in the box. Don't be afraid of getting it wrong, of course. Gary's gone for 7. Lisa, how many do you think? Maybe not sure. Okay, well, let's have a look. There's 6. So, Gary, if you know one I don't, please tell me. So, Lisa, brilliant. So you put down for Care Act, IMCA, and children. Yeah, you got the main ones. So we're going to add complaints to that list. And then IMCA, there's the 2 roles that are slightly different. Or not different, sorry, but they came at different times. One is the IMCA role, and then we've got the DOLs as well. And this is the order chronologically of when they were introduced, and I'm just going to quickly recap on each of them so that you've got a real solid understanding of who is entitled to each of these. So the Children Act, it was introduced in 2002, and the Children Adoption Act at the time amended the Children Act 1989, which is kind of the big one for children's legislation, by inserting into section 26, which is the section that deals with complaints for children and young people. And it gave children and young people who are thinking about making a complaint the legal right to have an independent advocate. Now, what's beautiful about this is that the accompanying guidance, which is statutory, so it has to be complied with, and that's called Get It Sorted. And Get It Sorted clearly says that a young person who is thinking about making a complaint or making a representation under section 26 of the Children Act is entitled to an advocate. Now, what that means in practice is that any young person receiving services by the local authority that's also, kind of is triggered under the Children Act. So we're looking at children and young people in care, but we're also looking at children in need and children and young people who are affected by child protection conferences. And also things like assessments to be a child in need to see if provision can be given under section 17 of the Children Act, which tends to be things like that could be respite if the child or young person's got a disability. So it's not just about looked after children, it's much broader than that. And all of those young people, when they're making representations about their care or the services they received, and remember, representation is just a view. Making a representation is me just saying this is what I think about the care plan or this is what I want. All of those young people can have an advocate. Now that causes problems when you see advocacy services that are targeting, say, and I've seen this particularly in child protection conferences, where it targets young people over the age of 8 or over the age of 10, because you think, well, what if I'm 7? I still have a legal right to make a representation about the plan and about what I want, and therefore I'm entitled to an advocate. So I don't know if you come across that in your area, but children and young people definitely, any representation about anything that the local authority is preparing to do. The only, the big exclusions to this would be education, because education doesn't come under the Children Act, and youth justice and health, because they're not governed by the Children Act. But for everything else, yeah, the young people can have an advocate. That all makes sense. Chuck in any questions. So Gary, never been involved with kids advocacy at all. And to be honest, that as we keep saying, advocacy is advocacy. Advocacy with children is no different. It's still voice, choice, self-advocacy, representation, checking that the legal pro, it's all the same things. It's just different legislation really that governs it. Okay, let's look at the second one, which was IMCA. And just to recap, the Mental Capacity Act came in, well, it was received a royal assent in 2005, and it was implemented a few years later. But that basically gives a person who's been assessed as lacking capacity in two decisions. One is a long-term change of accommodation, and the second is about serious medical treatment. And if they don't have anyone who can act as their consultee, and the consultee role is basically just giving a view, so they don't have anyone who's appropriate to give a view about what should happen. For that small, and it is a small group of people, you know, we're talking hundreds rather than thousands across a year. I think, is it about 2,000 to 3,000 people might have an IMCA? I may have made that up, I'm not sure, but it's a small group of people comparatively speaking to other types of advocacy. And they have to have an IMCA appointed, so they don't have a choice. And the language there is that an IMCA is instructed, and the IMCA's role is to support that person to be involved in the decisions as much as they can, and then also to represent them through that decision-making process. Gary, you know about IMCA, you've been involved in IMCA. Lisa, are you working alongside IMCAs? And I say, if you've got any questions, just chuck it in. But that's IMCA, and that was the first statutory role for adults, certainly, that was interested. We should be getting clinician. Yeah, so there's always been an issue with low referrals for serious medical treatment decisions, hasn't there? And that's, I think, indicative of the kind of attitude and health around doctors just making decisions. So I think that's too controversial. Oh, brilliant! So you've worked with some IMCAs, at least that's great. And there's lots of overlap between IMCA and CARE Act, which we're going to look at a bit later. Okay, let's have a little look at IMHES. That came in 2 years later and is England and Wales. There are slightly different entitlements to IMHE in England than in Wales. The Welsh provisions are much stronger and broader. But let's have a little look at England first. So if in England, anybody who is subject to compulsion is the phrase, so basically held under the Mental Health Act. So you're detained, the common sections would be section 2 for assessment, section 3 for treatment, section 3741, which kind of authorises the prison transfers, patients on CCO. Gary, you've said saw my blog. Yeah, I've been sitting on that for a while, but there are massive issues in transforming care. So people, adults with and young people with autism and learning disabilities being held for huge amounts of time without proper planning, and advocates could be doing more to get people out. But people who want an IMHE generally want support in getting out, don't they? That's probably the number one issue. But going back to entitlement, so people who living in the community on a community treatment order or on guardianship, which is being used less and less, all of those people are entitled to an IMHE. You're not entitled to an IMHE in England if you're an informal patient, or if you're held on the emergency sections, the holding powers under section 4 and 5 and 136 by the police. But in Wales, it's much easier to remember because it's essentially anyone, whether you're informal or formal, anyone who is receiving care and treatment, which includes assessment, in a psychiatric hospital. So it's much broader, and you can have an IMHE. And there's overlap between IMHE and CARE Act, IMHE and complaints, and IMHE and IMCA. Person can have both, so that's what we're going to have a little look at in a second. NHS complaints advocacy is very simple. This is absolutely open access service to anybody thinking about making a complaint about NHS services. Gary, you put this section 2 included. So yes, a person detained under section 2 for assessments, that's the short one, for 28 days or up to 28 days. Yes, that's included in England and Wales. So if you're held under section 2, you can have an IMHE. Okay. Right, DOLS. So there are 3 roles introduced under the Deprivation of Liberty safeguards that we've got. 39A is when a person doesn't have a representative to support them as the DOL's authorisation is being considered. And the IMCA role there is to support the person to be involved and to represent them, represent their views. 39C is when the person has an unpaid relevant persons representative, but they no longer can take that role on, and there's a short gap. Then the law requires a 39C IMCA to be instructed. And then a 39D IMCA is a role that's seriously underused in most parts of the country. And that's when you've got an unpaid relevant persons representative and they need support in basically accessing the safeguards. So either requesting a review or challenging, appealing the DOLs, then an IMCA can support that unpaid RPR and or the person themselves. Then as add-on to that, many services also provide a paid relevant persons representative service, and they also would do a 1.2 visitor, which is essentially a community DOLS, which is also known as DIDS in some area, which is deprivation in domestic settings, DIDS. I don't know what they call them in your areas. Gary said RPR is very rarely offered a 39D. It depends on what area you're in, actually. We did a freedom of information request, and some areas, it is astounding how many times an IMCA is offered. In Warwickshire and Lincolnshire, it was nearly 1,000 IMCAs were offered under 39D, and then in other areas it's 0. So it was a massive range, and really tells us about the difference the local authority makes in making advocacy accessible, and that if the process there and the DOL's office understand IMCA and advocacy, and they're offering it to people, to unpaid reps, it can really make a difference. But yeah, from literally 0 to 1,000 was the range of time, the number of times that IMCA been offered under 39D. Right, Care Act, which you're going to be experts in. So remember, we use the football analogy of a football team, 4-4-2. You've got 4 groups of people, which is the adult with the care needs, the carers of those adults, young people in transition, and the carers of those young people. So they are all entitled to advocacy as they're going through the 4 decision-making processes of assessment, planning, the review of that care plan, and safeguarding. And then the 2 criteria is that they don't have anyone available, appropriate and willing to facilitate their active involvement, and there's a likelihood that they're going to face substantial difficulty being involved in those decisions. So for that group of people, they're entitled to a Care Act advocate. And again, we know that there are huge issues with people getting an advocate. The Department of Health estimated something like 150,000 people a year will be getting an advocate under the Care Act, and we know that that's not happening. So huge issues. Young carers, Children Act or Children's Advocacy. Okay, so it depends. We've got an overlap. So if you think about that period when a young person is becoming an adult, and in law the transition has to start at age 16. So we've got this period of we've got a period of time where a young person between the ages of 14 and 24 can be treated under Care Act legislation or the Children Act and accompanying legislation. The guide as to which one would be, well, I suppose as an advocate, which they can get the most out of, to be honest. But as a rough guide, as the young person is approaching adulthood, if their needs are going to be similar as an adult, you would start thinking about adult legislation earlier. If their needs are likely to stop when they become an adult, then it would be better to treat them under children's legislation. So let me give you an example. If you've got a young person who is a care leaver, and when they access support under the children's legislation and care leaving provision, if when they leave care at 24, say, they're no longer going to need support as an adult, well, then they would just receive support under the children's legislation. But let's imagine you've got a 17-year-old with some physical disabilities or learning disabilities, and they're going to have needs as an adult. Well, for that young person, when they're 16, 17, even 15, then what the legislation is saying is we should consider which is the most appropriate. And if they've got complex needs and they're going to have needs as an adult, then it should be the Care Act. So give you a proper example, you've got, say, a 15-year-old who, got a quite high level of needs because of learning disabilities, and they're going to need a huge package of care as an adult, which includes perhaps their own home, staff and team of 2 to 1 at all times. Then for that young person, it's appropriate for that planning to begin at 15, 16 under the Care Act to make that transition smooth. But there's no hard and fast rules about it. It's all about what's most appropriate for the individual. So if and when you come across people who fall into both, then I would advise that you kind of look into that and get legal advice as to which is going to get that person the most optimum level of support, should we say. I think that was a really long-winded answer to your question. Short answer is either. As you like, Robertson. Right. Okay. Overlap number 1. Oh, before we move on, actually, I should say, any questions about any of those 6? Any of those 6 statutory roles, or are they all okay? If they're all okay, I shall move on to look at the overlap. So let's have a look at the IMCA and the Care Act overlap. So when a person has been held in a hospital, mostly under Section 3, they may be entitled to aftercare under Section 117 of the Mental Health Act. Now, the benefits of Section 117 aftercare primarily is that you can't charge for aftercare. So a young person or an adult receiving care and support in the community, if it's just through the Care Act, they will need to have a financial assessment and could be required to contribute financially to that package of care. But if it's under Section 117, they don't. You can't charge somebody for aftercare. And aftercare is quite broad. It's not just about mental health. My understanding, it's also about care and support that prevents, the deterioration of somebody's mental health. So if you've got somebody in hospital, whilst they're in hospital, the IMCA is going to be supporting them on issues of mental health. So, Gary, I'll come to your question in a sec. So when the person's in hospital, the IMCA will be supporting them to appeal that detention if they want to, issues around medication, access and second opinion, leave, all the provisions of the Mental Health Act, the IMCA is going to be focusing on. It's not about broader issues like housing, benefits, those types of things. Once they are going to be discharged, they're no longer going to be entitled to an IMCA because you're only entitled to an IMCA whilst you're in hospital and detained under the Act. So you've got this kind of linear journey of somebody in hospital entitled to IMCA, but then when they come out, when they're discharged and in the community, they'll have a Care Act advocate. But of course, the planning for that discharge is going to begin whilst they're in hospital. So the Care Act advocate needs to be working with people in hospital to prepare them for the discharge planning and make sure that their goals and their outcomes and their views and preferences, all those things are included in the care plan. Now, Gary, you mentioned the blog, and in that blog, I was suggesting that IMCAs need to be doing a lot more about discharge planning and pushing for that earlier and pushing for stronger planning whilst in hospital. So this is where the overlap comes. The question is, who does the discharge planning? And the answer is either or both. And in one way, and I'm going to say this a lot today, it doesn't really matter who does it as long as somebody is doing it. And that's if you've got the contract for IMCA and Care Act, it's going to be less problematic because the same advocate can do both. If, however, the contracts are commissioned through different services, that's going to require some thinking and certainly conversation, joint working between the two providers to make sure that the IMCA and the Care Act aren't duplicating. Or worse, they both expect the other one to do it, so neither does it. Gary, you said about when Section 117 is rescinded. I'm not sure what you mean when it comes to an end, or tell me more about what you're thinking, or are you thinking about a specific person there? If you've got your mic, talking to your mic as well. When is it? So why would it be removed? It can be removed sometimes. I'm probably going to show my inexperience now. I'm not sure. So if somebody's eligible for care and support and they've removed Section 117, I guess we'd be challenging that. But yes, you could fall onto the Care Act provisions. If it's a specific person, give me a call afterwards and we can look into it. But I'm not sure what else I can say about that. On what grounds it can be removed. I don't know, and I don't know the timescales either, so we can look that up. Sorry, I can't give you a definitive answer on that, but maybe we can look that up and talk later. Okay, let's get back to the overlap between IMCA and Care Act. The other overlap is safeguarding. So if you've got a person detained in a hospital and there are safeguarding concerns, so typically that could be because of other patients in the hospital, or there will be times, you know, horrifically where there's abuse because of the hospital. And I'm thinking of Mendip House, which has been in the news this week, where I know that wasn't a mental health hospital, but adults with learning disabilities in care home were abused by staff financially and physically and emotionally. So there's an issue there. If it's in a mental health hospital, who takes up the advocacy role through the safeguarding inquiry? And similar to the advocate, it can be both. It can be either the IMCA or the Care Act. Whilst the Care Act is the piece of legislation where safeguarding is dealt with and advocacy is provided for, if you've got an IMCA already working with that person, it's perfectly okay for the IMCA to continue to work with that person, although technically it should be Care Act. The other overlap is with family involvement. So for people detained under the Mental Health Act who have family who are involved in their care and treatment and discharge planning, if they're going to become unpaid carers, or they are unpaid carers, then they are entitled to support under the Care Act. And if they hit the eligibility for an advocate, then they can access advocacy under that provision too. IMCAs don't traditionally, well, they wouldn't support families. However, and I refer to the blog again, I was suggesting that with non-instructed advocacy for patients, particularly with learning disabilities and autism, who are coming under the transforming care, advocates need to be talking a lot more with families whilst we're thinking about that longer term discharge planning and what care and support people need in the community. So there's an overlap there between the IMCA and the Care Act. So let's make this real. Lisa, you said you're a Care Act. Do you get involved much in mental health settings or with people coming out of hospital? Or is this, and the phrase we use, is an opportunity for growth? Is this something to talk to your service about, checking that those people are receiving advocacy? So you said, I have a few clients within safeguarding and Section 1. Beautiful, brain. So you've already got this. Lovely. You already know this stuff then. Great, great. Okay, let's have a look at overlap number 2. IMCA and IMCA. Well, this is quite straightforward because the IMCA role is so blinking narrow, isn't it? It's two very, very specific decisions, and eligibility is very, very clear. Now, the three, I think, points where somebody would have an IMCA and an IMCA and an IMCA would be if they are detained in hospital in England or in Wales, just in a psychiatric hospital. And they lack capacity to make decisions about a change of accommodation. So essentially, if the local authority is going to arrange where they live after hospital, and they lack capacity to make that decision and don't have anyone to consult, they have to have an IMCA to be involved in that change of accommodation decision. And this is the example where the person would have an IMCA for the mental health treatment and discharge planning, an IMCA for the change of accommodation in the discharge planning, and a Care Act advocate for the broader care and support planning. So that example would trigger 3 types of advocacy, and it's redonkulous, isn't it, to suggest that 3 advocates would be supporting this one person who lacks capacity. What should happen is 1 advocate, probably the IMCA, and I say that because the IMCA will already know and have a relationship with that person. The IMCA can take on, assuming that you've got the contract to do those roles. Does that make sense? Chuck any questions or comments if not. Then there's an overlap with DOLs. So if somebody is, again, coming out of hospital and they're going to be subject to deprivation of liberty safeguard, then they may need an IMCA involved in that. And similarly, if the person, whilst they are receiving care and treatment for the mental health condition in a hospital, they also develop a physical condition that requires serious medical treatment. So people in hospital, mental health hospitals, have strokes, develop cancer, the same as the rest of the population. Now, if they lack capacity, don't have a consultancy, they're going to have an IMCA. So that overlap is a bit clearer. It's less of an overlap. It's more that the IMCA is going to get involved in the very single specific decision of SMT, whilst the IMCA is doing the broader planning. But again, it can be the same person. And Gary, you've made a comment about more advocates need to be cross-trained, basically, and qualified in more than one discipline. And yeah, you're right. And I think if we could redo the qualification units, I think I would argue that it's just a qualification and advocacy and everybody does everything. Because IMCAs need to know about the Mental Capacity Act, IMCAs need to know about the Care Act, and so on. Well, let's leave that one for another day, hey? Right, overlap number 3, IMCA and the Care Act. Right, this is what the Care Act says. People who qualify for an IMCA in relation to care planning and care review, if the planning will result in an eligible change of accommodation, so if the local authority is going to arrange that long-term move, they will nearly in all cases qualify for advocacy under the Care Act. So shorthand is saying that is everyone who has an IMCA, everyone who has an IMCA in change of accommodation decisions should have an advocate under the Care Act for the broader care and support planning. That makes sense? So as soon as a change of accommodation decision's triggered and an IMCA is instructed, I will be asking questions, do they have a Care Act advocate for the broader care and support planning and review? And it would make absolute sense for the IMCA and Care Act advocate to be the same one. Is that okay? Any questions, pop them in. The other overlap is with safeguarding, because as you probably know, the Mental Capacity Act introduced a power which basically allows the local authority to instruct an advocate in safeguarding processes if the person lacks capacity. But since the Mental Capacity Act, we've had the Care Act, and the Care Act duties for advocacy and safeguarding are much broader, are much earlier in the process, and they impact on more people. So that's why we say safeguarding, advocacy and safeguarding now should always be under the Care Act. The only exclusion to that is if the person, the alleged perpetrator, lacks capacity, they are still entitled to an IMCA through the Mental Capacity Act. The Care Act doesn't touch that. So the only time you should have an IMCA really is for the alleged perpetrator who lacks capacity. And I wouldn't worry too much about it, because you can have either. And as long as somebody's got an advocate, I think that's the most important thing, rather than worrying too much about which contract it comes under. That makes sense. Okay, overlap number 4, children, young people and the Care Act. So we mentioned before about transition planning. So this is from the ages of 14 to 24, 25. And specifically, it's looking at young people as they transition from children's services to adult services. If they're going to have support needs as an adult, then Care Act advocacy is triggered if they've got substantial difficulty. But they could also have a young person's advocate if they have been receiving support as a child, young person. And again, it's just about, there's no hard rules around when that moves, but it's about thinking and talking to that young person about what's best for them at that time. But there will be an overlap. And carers, young carers as well, are also entitled to Care Act advocacy support. And the reason for that is because carers aren't defined by age in the Care Act. It just says carers. So if you've got a young carer of an adult who is having an assessment or a plan to outline how their needs are going to be met, they'll be entitled to an advocate if they face substantial difficulty, etc. So yeah, they could have either or both, and I would be thinking about that on a case-by-case basis. But we know from our freezer of information that young people in transition and young carers are not getting anywhere near what they should be for Care Act. And kind of over to you guys. Do you get referrals for young people under Care Act advocacy contracts? Gary said, "Do I know anyone who'd be willing to deliver the training?" I can think of somebody. Yeah, apparently they're very, very good. I can't think of the name, but yeah, I can think of somebody. Big dope. Right, youngsters with learning disability and capacity issues in transition must be challenging. In what way? Do you mean challenging for the advocate to support them and represent? Is that what you mean, or do you mean challenging getting the referrals? Tell me a little bit more, Gary. What were you thinking there? Because it shouldn't be any more challenging than working with adults with capacity, lacking capacity. It's we just use non-instructed advocacy. Workers, families out. Okay, so what, navigating that kind of triad of family, person, advocate, or even a square of chuck the professionals in. Yeah, I think it can be, because families obviously are traditionally more involved with young people. But I think it's an area that we need to start thinking about with adults as well. Adults with learning disabilities, their family members are heavily involved. And in non-instructed advocacy, and yeah, I can see you're putting comments there, which are beautiful. There's lots of opinions. It can be quite a sensitive situation. You've got competing interests. You might have overprotective parents who are very loving, but essentially restricting somebody's independence. And you've got a young adult who wants to be independent and take risks. Equally, you might have adult family members who are part of a problem. Who have perhaps contributed to somebody's mental ill health. It's very complex, isn't it? But in non-instructed advocacy, I think we need to be more confident in working with families, not relying on what they say, but certainly engaging with families and making decisions about, is it appropriate for me to go on this information? And I know lots of families who are incredibly loving, and they're the ones advocating for their adult children or young people, children, young people who are children. Lisa said, "I found it hard to come in to support them and be involved, but I know them the least of it." I'm not sure I understand that. Come and be involved. So you found it hard to come in and represent them. So yeah, I reckon that this is telling us around non-instructed advocacy, and that as a whole sector, we need to step up kind of our confidence, I think, in using non-instructed advocacy. It's something we're thinking of, and Gary mentioned, I wrote a blog at the beginning of the week around this issue about families. But yeah, but it's like anything, isn't it? Just because it's difficult doesn't mean that we don't do it. We just need to think clearly about it and work the problem, as they say, isn't it? Okay, let's have a look at overlap 5. Before we move on then, Gary, you said families see you as some Johnny come lately. Yeah, and I think some families are very suspicious of advocates. They see themselves as advocates. Yeah, all those qualities and features are there. But as I say, it doesn't mean that we don't engage with that. We need to address it, don't we? Yeah. Okay, let's look at complaints advocacy. So there's an overlap between complaints advocacy and bloody everything, really. So if you're in an NHS setting, whether that's a care home, a general hospital, a mental health hospital, receiving mental health support in the community, all of those, you may be entitled to an IMCA or an IMHA or a Care Act advocate. But if you want to complain about that, the services under the NHS, there's a question about who do you use. Do you go to your existing advocate, or do you go to a specialist complaints advocate? And technically, it can be either. And I'm thinking particularly the Mental Health Act. The code of practice that accompanies the Mental Health Act specifically says IMHAs can get involved in complaints, and IMHAs are well placed to raise complaints on behalf of people. But then I'm aware that some contracts specifically for IMHA say you're not to do complaints. We've got to refer that to the NHS Complaints Advocacy Service. And I do find that problematic, because if that was me, if I was in the mental health hospital and I knew an IMHA and I wanted to complain about the treatment I was receiving, I don't think I would want another advocate. I would want that IMHA to support me. And the problem I've got with is that choice is then taken from me, which I don't think is morally right, but also legal, because the code of practice says an IMHA can support. So be careful of anything like that. Essentially, I would argue that it's up to the person, and they have got a choice on whether their existing advocate supports them with a complaint or whether they access complaint advocacy. So yeah, but as a Care Act advocate and the person wants to complain, it's entirely appropriate for you to support them with that complaint. Okay, and I think this may be the last overlap. And this is just to throw in with any element of care planning, particularly if the person lacks capacity to consent to proposals and the way care is offered and delivered. If that's going to lead to deprivation of liberty, then they're probably going to need an IMCA if they don't have people to support them. So you've got a Care Act advocate for the broader planning, and then an IMCA to support them through the DOLS authorisation and perhaps appealing that or checking, well, I'm thinking RPR there, aren't I? That can checking conditions are being upheld and adhered to. But yeah, and again, it can be the same advocate. It can be the same advocate. It doesn't have to be 2 separate advocates. And that's really up to you and your service to decide which one. Okay, so some broad things to think about when we're thinking about the different roles. The first one is who decides. So is this a decision that you can take as an advocacy service? Have the commissioners given you the autonomy and freedom to do that, to decide which advocacy is appropriate, or do you have to go back and get instruction? And that's kind of grey. It's something to think about. Commissioning will have an impact on how easy it is to get the right advocate. So if it's joint commissioned through one kind of entry point, then that's dead easy. If it's not, and it's different entry points for an IMCA and an IMHA and the Care Act, that's going to be difficult, but requires extra thinking. I would also chuck in here about the recording and analysis of data. So making sure that your recording is capturing your work in the different contracts, and where somebody's entitled to different advocacy roles, thinking how are you going to capture that. And a common one is, I think, IMCA and Care Act. So if you've got a change of accommodation, you know, that's been triggered as part of a review of a care plan, you're going to go and see that person as a Care Act advocate and an IMCA. You're not going to record that twice as two different bits of work under two different contracts. So it just needs some thought given to how it's going to be captured. Training we've mentioned, so it's desirable for people to be cross-trained so that they can effortlessly take on the different roles. And I just wanted to end on the very simple point that the advocacy role is the same. It's no different. Advocacy is advocacy. It's just got a different focus, either because the decision's different or the setting's different, so it's different legislation. But the advocacy is the same. It's always about voice. It's always about rights. It's always about that person. Never about best interests. Always about choice. It's the same. Okay, so that's the end. Gary, I can see you've popped in a few comments, which is brilliant. So you've put people's care and residency and their access to advocacy seldom takes fluctuating capacity into account. Okay, tell me any more about that. Are you thinking that the kind of professionals aren't assessing capacity properly, or they're making assumptions about that? Because yeah, and then your second point about providers avoid making advocacy available is a problem. Yeah, you're right, and we know that we've heard ex-commissioners, haven't we, say things like advocacy costs us money because advocates get people better care plans. Yeah, carers make choices when capacities come back. Okay, so yeah, we do get that ironic thing, don't we, where if the person's disagreeing with the professionals, they lack capacity, and then as soon as they agree, they suddenly have capacity. Yeah, that's a bit cynical, isn't it? But yeah, so things to check obviously would be, has capacity been assessed? Is it about this particular decision? All those basic, checking about the Mental Capacity Act. He said, I feel like a lot of them see capacity as static and use it as a reason not to involve. You're totally right. People, we still see it 10 years on with the Mental Capacity Act. The blanket capacity judgments are made. People saying this person lacks capacity, and we need to be saying in what, when, and what support. Remember that second principle of the Mental Capacity Act. All practical support must be given to help the person make choices and decisions. So that's where, as a Care Act advocate, for instance, we can be coming in and asking those questions about, well, what support have you put in? Has the person been given enough time to go through this information? Have they had a person they know go through it with them? Those types of things. But yeah, as Gary said, spot on. Yeah. Okay, any questions about the overlap or the interplay between anything that we've talked about? Any questions or comments that you'd like to make? Kind of in summary, people are going to be entitled to more than one, but the same advocate can do more than one as long as they're trained. Gary, you said yes. I don't know what you said yes to. You said yes, or you're just going yes. It's all clear. I think a new module might be needed to add into play. No, piss off. We're not having a new module. No, if anything, we want less modules. How to be multi-skilled. Well, you are multi-skilled, and the multi-skilled bit might be a misnomer, because it's not different skills, that are required. To be an advocate, you need to be skilled in communication, you need to be skilled in rights, those things. I quantified if I say multi-qualified. Yeah, but what we need to be is knowledgeable about different bits of legislation. But to be a good advocate, I think we need to have that anyway. Like the Human Rights Act, we don't need a specialist trainer for the Human Rights Act. Everyone needs to know about that. But yeah, the qualifications and also the QPM, of course, help commissioners to take us seriously. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I totally agree. Brilliant. Okay. Any other comments then? Or questions? If not, I'm going to make a quick cup of tea, and then we've got another session at 11:30 looking at advocacy through assessment processes under the Care Act. So might see you there. Okay, I'm going to sign off and just get prepared for my next session. If you two want to carry on the conversation, that's fine. I'll leave it running.